It wasn't weakness that destroyed them. It was strength, unconscious, unclaimed, leaking into places it was never meant to go. Carl Jung saw this paradox again and again. Those with the most luminous gifts, the rarest depths of perception, were also the ones most likely to collapse under invisible forces. Not because they lacked resilience, but because their brilliance made them targets of social echo chambers, emotional parasites, and the darkest mechanisms of the unconscious. You've been told that sensitivity is fragility, that introspection is indulgence, that withdrawal from the crowd means you are broken. But Jung's case files revealed the opposite. The sensitive were not weak, they were overloaded with signals. The introverts were not lost, they were in exile from a culture too noisy to tolerate their silence. And those who cracked under pressure were not defective. They were undergoing what Jung called the Nigredo, the blackening stage of transformation, where an old self dies so something greater can emerge. They see too much, they sense too much, they feel too much. They sense lies others call truths. They feel undercurrents others dismiss as nothing. They see dangers that society prefers to ignore. But here lies the danger, because seeing what others don't comes at a cost. The cost is isolation. The cost is projection. The cost is becoming the vessel for everyone else's denied shadow. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And those who fail to heed this warning are consumed, not by external enemies, but by the very forces they refuse to face. Consider the empath who spends years absorbing every wound in their family, believing that love means carrying the unbearable. Consider the rare personality who questions reality itself, only to be accused of being too intense, too much. Consider the one who awakens spiritually only to lose all motivation because they have seen through the game of social illusion. These are not edge cases. They are warning signs of a cultural epidemic Jung foresaw, the annihilation of the rarest souls, not through violence, but through psychological suffocation. This wasn't depression, this wasn't laziness, this wasn't weakness. This was the inevitable collapse of those who carried more than their share of the collective unconscious. And here's what makes it urgent for you now. Jung discovered that once these dangerous psychological environments take hold, echo chambers, comparison arenas, performance theaters, they don't just harm you temporarily, they rewire your brain to replicate their poison, even when you are alone. What begins as a defense mechanism becomes destiny. What starts as survival becomes self-betrayal. That is the paradox, and that is the stake. The very traits that could make you extraordinary are the ones most likely to destroy you, unless you learn to transform them consciously. Unless you claim what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming whole. The danger isn't that you are too sensitive. The danger is that your sensitivity, denied and unclaimed, becomes a weapon against you. The danger isn't that you question too much. The danger is that your questions, unanswered, collapse into despair. The danger isn't that you see what others don't. The danger is that without guidance, your vision becomes your isolation. Jung's cases prove this. Transformation is possible, but only if you recognize the battlefield you are already standing on, because this is not just about you. The way you navigate these traps determines not only your survival, but the cultural future of sensitivity, depth, and truth. Jung noticed something long before today's dating apps and relationship goals culture. Society has a way of convincing you that to stand alone is a flaw. He called it collective possession, the mass hypnosis of cultural norms that overrides individual reality. And nowhere is this possession clearer than in the distortions surrounding singlehood. Let me name them one by one so you can see how they've been operating inside your own psyche. Distortion. 1. Pair or perish. From childhood fairy tales to social media feeds, you've been told that completion comes only through another, The lone individual is cast as suspect, selfish, broken, or pitiable. Jung warned that when you live only through the expectations of the crowd, you wear a mask, he called the persona, a mask that protects you in public while slowly suffocating your authentic soul. The pressure to be coupled isn't about love, it's about conformity. Distortion. 2. Chemistry means destiny. How many have been fooled by that electric spark, mistaking adrenaline for archetypal union? Jung saw it repeatedly, the anima and animus, the inner images of the opposite, projected onto strangers with intoxicating force. Because the projection feels like magic, therefore, it blinds you to reality. You don't see the person, you see your own unconscious reflected back, and you call it fate. Distortion. 3. Healing happens only in relationship. Modern psychology often repeats this partial truth, that wounds must be healed in intimacy. But Jung cautioned that without a strong individual container, intimacy simply amplifies dysfunction. The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances, he wrote. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. The danger? If only one has done the work, only one gets transformed. These distortions share one mechanism. They weaponize your longing. They convince you that solitude is failure, that speed is proof of love, that exhaustion is devotion. Jung recognized this as the gaslight of the unconscious, when cultural shadows convince you that your intuition is the problem. Because you were told that to be alone is shameful, therefore you rush into fusion before you are ready. Because you equated chemistry with destiny, therefore you ignore red flags and call them soul signs. Because you believed that healing is possible only in romance, therefore you offered your unhealed self as both doctor and patient. This is how the collective lie becomes personal collapse. This is how culture turns individuation, the birthright of becoming whole, into pathology. But there is a way through. It begins with reclaiming the very words we use. When you shift your language, you shift your consciousness. And that is why the next step is to define the core concepts clearly so you can stop being tricked by the distortions and start seeing reality. Before we go deeper, we need a shared language. Jung insisted that most suffering is worsened not by experience itself, but by the confusion of undefined terms. The soul suffers most, he wrote, when it has no words for what it endures. Let's end that confusion here. Individuation. This is the spine of Jung's entire psychology. Individuation is the process of becoming whole, separating from the collective's demands, integrating your shadow, and living from the center of your authentic self. Without individuation, singlehood feels like emptiness. With it, singlehood becomes alchemy. Solitude turns into strength. The shadow. The shadow is not just your darkness. It is everything you have exiled. Anger, you were told, was unseemly. Confidence, you were told, was arrogance. Desire, you were told, was dangerous. In relationships, unclaimed shadow doesn't disappear. It gets projected onto your partner. That's why singleness is not avoidance, but defense. It gives you time to reclaim your shadow before it recruits someone else to carry it. Archetypal magnetism. Jung saw how anima and animus images, inner blueprints of the masculine and feminine, get projected onto others with intoxicating force. This is why you feel that dizzying recognition as if you've known someone forever. But it isn't them, it's you, gazing at your own unconscious image. Archetypal magnetism feels like destiny, but functions like a trap unless you know what it is. The psychological container. Think of the container as your inner vessel, the structure of ego strong enough to hold eros without collapsing. Jung compared the weak container to an alchemical flask. If it cracks under heat, transformation becomes explosion. Solitude is where you fire the clay of your vessel until it can withstand real union. These are not abstractions. They are the tools you will wield in the battlefield of modern intimacy. Because if you can name individuation, therefore you will no longer mistake fusion for love. If you can name shadow, therefore you will stop blaming others for what you refuse to face. If you can name archetypal magnetism, therefore you will recognize projection instead of worshiping it. If you can name container, therefore you will finally prepare for a love that does not destroy you. With these concepts in place, we can now step into the living theater of Jung's work, a real case where the cost of premature fusion nearly shattered a life. Jung believed theory was empty unless it bled into life. So let me take you into one of his case vignettes, which mirrors what countless of you have lived. She was not weak. Let's call her Maya, an intelligent woman in her 30s, recently stirred by what she thought was a spiritual awakening. She had left behind shallow circles, taken up journaling, even begun to dream vividly for the first time in years. In Jung's language, her unconscious was preparing the ground. Then came the meeting, a man who seemed to radiate recognition. Their conversations were volcanic, hours passing like minutes, silence humming with intensity. Maya told Jung, "It feels as if I have known him for lifetimes." But Jung had seen this before. What she called destiny was her anima projection, her inner image cast outward with blinding force. At first, the fusion was intoxicating. Within weeks, they were speaking of marriage, merging finances, even planning joint spiritual work. But soon, Maya's diary began to fill with doubts. She no longer wrote about her dreams, only about his moods. She no longer described her projects, only his promises. Her authentic flame had been replaced by the flickering of another's lantern. Jung noticed the signs immediately. Her container was unformed. She had mistaken spiritual stirrings for solid structure. Her shadow was unclaimed. The ambition she had disowned now returned as envy when he advanced. Her individuation was aborted. Instead of moving toward wholeness, she regressed into fusion. Because she had not built a vessel, therefore her fire leaked. Because she had not faced her shadow, therefore she fed his. Because she mistook projection for reality, therefore she lost the thread of her own life. Within 6 months, she was depleted. Her work had faltered, her friendships had withered, her sense of self was reduced to a mirror reflecting his dramas. When the bond collapsed, Maya came to Jung broken. But Jung didn't call it failure. He called it initiation. This was not the end of her life. It was the end of her illusion. Jung wrote often that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. But if one of those substances is still unstable, the reaction is not transformation. It is detonation. Maya's story is the proof. Premature fusion doesn't lead to union. It leads to collapse. Her collapse became the catalyst for Jung's warning. Singleness is not avoidance. It is spiritual self-defense. It is the necessary laboratory where you fire the clay of your container until it can withstand the alchemical heat of love. And so the question becomes, what exactly makes conscious singleness protective? What functions does it serve that no relationship, however beautiful, can ever substitute? Here is the paradox. You think being alone leaves you vulnerable. In truth, being prematurely entangled is what shatters you. Singleness, far from weakness, is a fortress. Jung saw it again and again. Patients who tried to leap into love before building themselves fell into collapse, while those who endured solitude forged something indestructible. Let's make this precise. 1. Singleness resets your boundaries. In fusion, your edges blur. You wake up monitoring someone else's emotions instead of your own. Singleness interrupts that trance. It forces you to ask, where do I end and the world begin? Jung called this individuation, the rediscovery of your own contours after being swallowed by the collective. Because you withdraw, therefore you reclaim the map of your own soul. 2. Singleness detoxes projection. When you are always gazing into another's eyes, your shadow hides in theirs. Alone, there is no screen to project upon. Your anger, ambition, jealousy, desire, they return home, demanding integration. Jung warned that shadow unclaimed will always be carried by others until you face it yourself. Singleness strips away the scapegoats. It shows you your own face. 3. Singleness clarifies archetypal images, that intoxicating pull you once called destiny. In solitude, you begin to see it for what it is, your inner anima or animus, not your twin flame. Jung wrote that these images are bridges to the unconscious, but only when recognized as symbols, not mistaken for flesh. Alone, you learn to hold the archetype without confusing it with the person. 4. Singleness restores your psychic energy. Jung often spoke of psychic economy. Every thought, every emotion is an expenditure. In unhealthy bonds, your energy leaks into managing moods, repairing dramas, absorbing projections. In solitude, that current is rerouted inward. Your vitality is reclaimed for dreams, art, vision, and the slow work of becoming whole. Do you see the inevitability here? Because you step back from the crowd, therefore you step into your own center. Because you interrupt projection, therefore you recover the shadow's gold. Because you reclaim energy, therefore your nervous system learns peace instead of perpetual fawning. This isn't running from love, it's training for it. Without this defensive season, you enter intimacy as a hollow vessel, fragile, porous, exploitable. With it, you enter as an alchemical flask, sealed, fired, able to withstand the heat of Eros without cracking. Jung was blunt. To refuse solitude is to refuse transformation. You must first learn to stand in the fire alone before you can share it with another. So the question becomes, how? How do you turn solitude into a crucible rather than a prison? Jung gave us a map, a 3-phase protocol that mirrors the ancient alchemists he studied so obsessively. The alchemists spoke of 3 stages: Nigredo, Albedo, Rubedo, blackening, whitening, reddening. Jung saw in their cryptic diagrams not primitive chemistry, but the map of psychological rebirth. If you are to use singleness as self-defense, you must walk these phases consciously. Otherwise, you drift in circles, mistaking loneliness for transformation. Let's walk them step by step. Phase 1. Nigredo, dissolve. The Nigredo is the black sun, the death of the old self. For you, it begins when you step into solitude, and the first wave hits, the unbearable silence. You notice how much of your identity was borrowed from others. You feel emptiness, restlessness, maybe even despair. Jung called this the blackening, because the light of old illusions burns out. Practices: keep a projection journal. Each time you blame someone, your ex, your parents, society, ask, what part of this belongs to me? Fast from new entanglements. Declare a season of no romantic commitments. Checkpoint: you stop texting old flames just to soothe the silence. You endure the void without running back to the familiar cage. Because you allow the blackening, therefore you no longer confuse collapse with failure. It is initiation. Phase 2. Albedo, clarify. After the blackening comes the whitening. Here the ashes settle, and you begin to see yourself clearly, stripped of the projections that once defined you. Jung described this as the emergence of symbolic clarity, values surfacing from beneath the rubble. Practices: name your 3 non-negotiables: truth, play, service, whatever they are, write them as your personal commandments. Conduct an energy audit. Which friendships leave you diminished, which restore you? Train boundaries with small refusals. Decline invitations that drain your soul. Checkpoint: you say no without writing a novel of explanations. Your worth is no longer measured by how quickly you appease. Because you clarify, therefore you begin to trust your own compass, not the crowd's. Phase 3. Rubedo, integrate. The reddening, the return of fire. Here the goal is not isolation forever, but integration, bringing the shadow and the light into one coherent self. Jung called this individuation, the birth of a person who can enter union without disappearing. Practices: date slowly, as experiment, not desperation. Follow the 2 keys rule: Pursue only when there is both desire and dignity. Create a weekly sovereignty ritual, Friday nights dedicated to art, journaling, or visioning. Checkpoint. Attraction no longer feels like compulsion, it feels like peace. You do not chase intensity, you recognize resonance. Because you complete the reddening, therefore you become a vessel able to hold the sacred fire of love without shattering. This three-phase protocol is not theoretical. Jung saw it in his patients who endured solitude with consciousness rather than resentment. The ones who refused the protocol either recycled the same dramas with new faces or collapsed into despair. The choice is simple. Endure the black sun, clarify in the whitening, and emerge in the reddening, or keep circling the wheel of projection and collapse. And so, having walked the stages, the next challenge is practical. What tools will keep you steady as you navigate this crucible? The rituals, scripts, and micro-drills that translate lofty psychology into daily survival. Theory without practice collapses into fantasy. Jung himself warned that insight is useless unless it incarnates in action. So here is the arsenal, small, repeatable practices that weaponize solitude into strength. Use them not once, but until they carve grooves in your psyche. 1. The boundary script. When pressured to accelerate intimacy, say calmly, "I move at the speed of trust." If that feels too slow, we are mismatched. This does two things at once. It honors your pace, and it exposes manipulation. Jung noted that those who resist your boundaries reveal more about themselves than about you. 2. The 72-hour rule. Never escalate emotionally, physically, financially without a 3-day pause. This simple delay protects you from projection. What feels like destiny in the moment often cools into clarity by the third sunrise. Because intensity fades, therefore truth emerges. 3. The somatic scan. After any interaction, sit still for 90 seconds. Ask, jaw, tight or loose, gut, knotted or calm. Breath shallow or steady? Jung insisted the body speaks the unconscious. If your body recoils, believe it before you believe words. 4. The archetype audit. When drawn to someone, ask, which myth am I enacting? Am I rescuing the damsel, chasing the muse, submitting to the wise father? Jung taught that archetypes are unavoidable, but conscious recognition turns them from prisons into teachers. 5. The ritual of sovereignty. Choose one night a week, Friday when others seek distraction, and make it sacred. Cook for yourself, read what nourishes, plan your path. This ritual trains the unconscious to associate solitude not with deprivation, but with richness. Jung observed that symbols transform the soul. Here, the symbol is your own table, your own fire. Each tool disrupts a cycle. The script stops erosion. The pause interrupts compulsion. The scan decodes the unconscious. The audit reveals projection. The ritual rewires solitude into strength. Because you practice these drills, therefore you recondition your psyche. No longer the sponge absorbing others, no longer the exile resenting silence, you become what Jung called psychologically autonomous, directed from within. But tools alone aren't enough. You must also unmask the lies that pull you back into fusion. These are the myths, subtle, seductive, that sabotage conscious singleness if left unchallenged. And it is time to expose them. Even with your tools sharpened, there are myths waiting to ambush you. Jung warned that the unconscious doesn't just hide in shadows, it disguises itself as truth. These myths are not whispered by enemies, they're recited by culture, family, and even your own inner critic. Unless you expose them, they will pull you back into premature fusion. Myth 1. If I don't pursue, I'll miss my fate. This is the myth of scarcity, that love is a train leaving the station, and you must leap aboard. Jung would call this archetypal inflation, identifying with the hero who must seize destiny at any cost. But real fate is not frantic. It respects readiness. because what is truly yours waits for your wholeness. Therefore, rushing is not destiny. It is sabotage. Myth 2. I am too much, or not enough. This is the voice of the shadow turned inward. Every trait society rejected, your intensity, your depth, your refusal to play shallow games, gets twisted into shame. Jung observed that rare personalities are often told they are defects, when in truth they are evolutionary forerunners. You are not too much. The world is too little. Myth 3. Healing is selfish. Here lies the martyr's trap. You were taught that your worth is measured by what you give away, that turning inward is neglect. Jung countered with ruthless clarity. Unhealed people export chaos. Because you have not faced your own shadow, therefore you hand it to lovers, friends, children who are forced to carry it for you. Healing isn't selfish, it is service. Myth 4. Solitude equals loneliness. This is the most insidious. To confuse solitude with emptiness is to mistake laboratory for coffin. Jung insisted that solitude is not absence, but presence, the presence of the self, the deeper core that only emerges when external noise dies away. Loneliness is a feeling. Solitude is a skill. And like all skills, it can be trained until it becomes sanctuary. Do you see the mechanism now? Each myth weaponizes a wound, scarcity, shame, guilt, fear. Because you believe them, therefore you rush, you shrink, you sacrifice, you despair. But once you name them as myths, their spell dissolves. And once you dissolve them, you are ready to face not illusions, but the real stakes, the dangers of entering love too soon before the vessel is forged. Jung warned, these dangers are not poetic metaphors. They are predictable destructions he documented again and again. Jung was blunt. To rush into intimacy before you are whole is not romance. It is regression. What feels like love becomes, in his words, participation, mystique. The fusion of two unfinished selves into a single confusion. It doesn't elevate you. It annihilates you. Here are the 3 dangers that arise when you collapse into fusion too early. Danger 1. Identity erosion. The first thing to dissolve is not your loneliness, but yourself. You outsource decisions, moods, even your sense of purpose to the other. Jung saw this repeatedly. The one who lacked individuation slid into dependency, then wondered why anxiety stalked them. Because you did not know who you were, therefore you tried to become who they needed, and lost yourself in the process. Danger 2. Shadow collusion. Every unclaimed part of you finds a partner in crime. Your disowned anger hooks onto their volatility. Your denied need for control aligns with their manipulation. Together, you form a perfect unconscious machine of suffering. Jung warned that what you refuse to face internally, you will live externally in your relationships. Fusion becomes not love, but the acting out of each other's shadow. Danger 3. Spiritual bypass. This is the most deceptive. You cloak the fusion in sacred language, soulmates, twin flames, divine union. But Jung's case notes are clear. When intimacy is used to avoid grief, individuation, or solitude, it becomes a bypass, not a bridge. You call it sacred, but it is escape. And every escape carries a price. The bill arrives in the form of collapse, betrayal, or despair. These dangers are not rare. They are predictable. And once you see them, you understand why solitude isn't avoidance. It's preparation. It gives you a fighting chance to meet another as an equal, not as a projection, not as a rescuer, not as a mask. Because when you risk pairing too soon, therefore you don't just gamble with love, you gamble with your very self. And so, the work of singleness is not only defensive, it is creative. It is the ground where you design the kind of love worth waiting for. Let's step there next. Once you see the dangers of premature fusion, the temptation is to swear off love entirely. But Jung never saw individuation as isolation. He saw it as preparation. The goal of singleness is not to avoid relationship. It is to refine your vessel until you can enter love without annihilation. So what kind of love is worth waiting for? Jung gave us clues scattered through his writings and casework. Let's name them clearly. Relational vision, co-regulation without control. In unconscious bonds, you regulate each other through fear, silence, guilt, threat. In conscious union, you regulate through presence. You calm without caging, comfort without controlling. Jung described this as the meeting of two individuated selves, each strong enough to stand alone, yet choosing to stand together. Non-negotiables: truth, repair, mission. 3 marks distinguish authentic partnership. Truth-telling: lies poison faster than betrayal. Repair culture: conflict is inevitable, avoidance is fatal. Mutual mission: each supports the other's individuation, not just survival. Because if the bond doesn't protect your wholeness, therefore, it is not love, but regression. Green flags: calm attraction, curiosity under conflict, pace, respect. When your nervous system feels peace, not panic, that's a sign. When disagreements provoke curiosity instead of contempt, that's a sign. When your partner honors the tempo of trust instead of rushing intensity, that's a sign. Jung insisted that genuine connection is recognized less by fireworks than by resonance, a quiet alignment that feels inevitable. Here's the paradox. When you design love worth waiting for, you make yourself immune to counterfeits. Projection loses its grip, scarcity loses its sting, desperation loses its disguise. Because you know the vision, therefore, you no longer settle for the illusion. But how do you know if you can live this design in practice? Theories collapse under pressure. You need to test it in real scenarios, moments where desire and discernment collide. That is where we go next. Insight is fragile until it is stress-tested. Jung insisted that individuation must be lived, not theorized. So let's walk through the real scenarios, the crucibles where your solitude and your preparation are put to proof. Scenario A, the high chemistry encounter. You meet someone whose presence ignites adrenaline. The conversation feels electric. Old you would have surrendered immediately, calling it destiny. But the integrated you applies the 72-hour rule. You slow the tempo. During that pause, you run the somatic scan, jaw tight, gut twisted, breath shallow, signs of projection at work. Because you resisted speed, therefore, you transformed what could have been collapse into clarity. Scenario B, the returning ex. Out of nowhere, a past lover reappears with apologies and promises. The temptation is nostalgia, the memory of comfort dressed as fate. But you open your projection journal. You reread your entries. Here's how I abandoned myself for them. Here's where I silenced my intuition. Instead of being seduced, you deploy the boundary script. I move at the speed of trust. Their reaction reveals everything. Because you rehearsed, therefore you refuse to repeat. Scenario C, the twin flame claim. Someone insists you are cosmically destined, that separation is illusion. This is archetypal magnetism at full force. But you conduct the archetype audit. You ask, which myth am I acting out? Savior, eternal child, star-crossed lovers? Once seen as symbol, the spell breaks. You can appreciate the archetypal beauty without collapsing into literal fusion. Because you discerned symbol from flesh, therefore you kept your container intact. Do you notice the pattern? Every scenario is an echo of Maya's story from earlier, fusion offered as salvation. But this time, you carry weapons: pause, script, scan, audit. What once destroyed you now becomes training. Jung observed that when the unconscious is made conscious, fate dissolves into choice. Each scenario proves this. You are no longer swept into inevitability. You are sculpting destiny. And yet, what if you are already in a relationship? Does this mean it's too late? Jung would say no. But it does mean you must practice micro-separations, ways of reclaiming yourself without ending the bond. What if you are not single, but already bound? Does that mean your chance for individuation has passed? Jung would say no. But he would also say this: without separation, there is no union. To remain fused is to remain unconscious. The task is not necessarily to leave, but to introduce what I call micro-separations, small acts of sovereignty that re-establish your container inside the bond. Micro-retreats. Once every few months, claim a day or two completely alone. No partner, no family, no digital tether. Jung practiced this himself, withdrawing to his tower at Bollingen to hear the psyche without interference. Solitude restores the container so you can return whole, not half. Shadow dialogues. Once a week, sit with your partner and name the archetypes at play. Today I felt myself slipping into the rescuer. Did you feel yourself becoming the child? Jung insisted that relationships are theaters where archetypes perform. Naming them removes their spell. Sovereignty hours. Build fixed blocks of time that belong only to you. Creative work, exercise, meditation. These are not indulgences, they are necessities. Jung warned that if you outsource your energy completely, you become resentful and eventually destructive. Sovereignty hours keep you psychologically solvent. Silent witnessing. Practice being together without words. Cook side by side. Read in the same room. Walk without filling the air. This trains both of you to exist without constant reassurance. True intimacy, Jung said, is not endless chatter, but shared presence. Each micro-separation interrupts fusion without breaking the bond. Because you withdraw, therefore you return with depth. Because you name archetypes, therefore you stop mistaking projection for truth. Because you defend sovereignty, therefore you protect love from corrosion. If you are partnered, this is your assignment. Introduce micro-separations not as rejection, but as respect. The paradox is this: by stepping apart, you make the togetherness real. But many resist this work. They say, it's too much effort. Why can't love be simple? Jung would answer with steel in his voice. Simplicity is for children. For adults, the danger is not effort, but evasion. And that leads us to the pitfalls, the common derailers that ruin the process if left unseen. Jung often warned that the greatest dangers in psychological work are not the monsters you see, they are the traps you don't notice. He called this shadow inflation, when the unconscious hijacks your progress and turns it into sabotage. If you practice conscious singleness or micro-separation, beware these 4 pitfalls. Pitfall 1, productive isolation. You tell yourself you're doing the work, but in truth, you're hiding forever. The fortress becomes a prison. Jung saw patients who mistook avoidance for individuation, endlessly journaling, endlessly analyzing, but never re-entering life. Avoidance may feel safe, but it's stagnation in disguise. Set a re-entry date or solitude will calcify into exile. Pitfall 2, spiritual perfectionism. You wait until you are flawless to risk intimacy. But Jung wrote, the most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. That means imperfection included. If you wait for purity, you'll wait forever. The goal is not perfection before love, it is wholeness within love. Choose good enough integrity, not unreachable flawlessness. Pitfall 3, the rebound revelation. After a long silence, someone appears with signs, synchronicities, cosmic language. You convince yourself it must be fate. Jung saw this often, the unconscious craving of the rejected child dressed up as divine destiny. Without caution, projection returns wearing new clothes. Apply your tools, pause, scan, audit, before you crown anyone a soulmate. Pitfall 4, narrative inflation. You make singleness itself your identity. I am the lone wolf, the mystic outsider. This is seductive because it turns suffering into superiority. But Jung warned against identification with archetypes. You become possessed by the image instead of integrating it. The goal is not to worship solitude. The goal is to use solitude as training, then return human. Do you see the pattern? Each pitfall is an overcorrection. You confuse protection with avoidance, readiness with perfection, longing with revelation, solitude with identity. Because of this confusion, therefore, you sabotage the very work meant to save you. And so the final question becomes, how do you guard against these pitfalls in daily life? The answer lies in maintenance, 5 simple practices that anchor the transformation long after the crisis has passed. Jung taught that individuation is never finished. The psyche is a living organism, and just like the body, it decays without discipline. Insight gained in solitude will rot if not sustained by rhythm. That is why you need practices, not grand rituals, but simple weekly anchors that keep your vessel sealed. 5 will suffice. 1. Sovereignty planning. Every Sunday, before you say yes to anyone else, put your mission on the calendar, not appointments, not chores, your mission. Jung warned that if you neglect the self, the unconscious revolts with neurosis. Sovereignty planning ensures you serve your core before you serve the crowd. 2. Projection journal. Twice a week, write down every accusation you made against others. Then ask, what part of me was I refusing to see? This practice strips projection of its power. Because you recall it, therefore you reclaim it. 3. Bodywork or stillness. 10 minutes daily, stretching, breathwork, or silent sitting. Jung called the body the psyche's companion. Ignore it, and your unconscious will scream through symptoms. Attend to it, and your unconscious whispers guidance. 4. Depth nutrition. Once a week, feed your psyche, not with news or noise, but with a myth, a poem, a sacred text. Jung himself turned to alchemy and scripture as symbolic food for the soul. Without depth nutrition, you starve on triviality. 5. Real community. At least twice a week, engage in conversation that is honest, not performative, not shallow networking, but soul contact. Jung insisted individuation is not isolation. It ripens in dialogue. Solitude gives strength. Community gives reflection. These 5 practices are not optional. They are your maintenance plan. Without them, the container cracks, projection returns, and solitude decays into exile. With them, you remain aligned, clear, grounded, sovereign. And now, as we approach the end of the arc, we must zoom out, beyond personal maintenance, into historical contrasts. What happens when these practices are neglected? And what becomes possible when they are honored? Jung gave us both cautionary tales and shining examples. Jung often studied not only patients, but also cultural figures, those who embodied the psyche's victories and its catastrophes. He knew that individual choices ripple into history. To understand why your solitude matters, we must look at 2 contrasting lives, one who collapsed under unconscious fusion and one who endured solitude until it became strength. The cautionary figure, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche saw more deeply than his age could bear. He named illusions, unmasked morality, declared the death of God. But Jung argued that Nietzsche lacked the container to hold his own visions. He fused with archetypes, the prophet, the destroyer, until they possessed him. Without boundaries, his solitude became madness. Nietzsche is the warning. Brilliance without grounding becomes annihilation. Because he refused balance, therefore he was consumed by the very archetypes he revealed. The exemplar, Carl Jung himself. After his break with Freud, Jung entered a terrifying solitude. For years he withdrew into what he called his confrontation with the unconscious. He painted visions, dialogued with figures from dreams, built his tower at Bollingen stone by stone. Many thought he had gone insane, but this was his crucible. Instead of fleeing solitude, he structured it, with rituals, with symbols, with labor. From this season emerged the Red Book, his greatest map of individuation. Jung is the example. Solitude embraced with discipline births wisdom that can guide generations. Do you see the polarity? Nietzsche dissolved in archetypal possession. Jung integrated through symbolic practice. One collapsed into shadow, the other transmuted shadow into light. This is why your solitude is not trivial. It is not merely about you finding peace. It is about whether your rare depth becomes medicine or poison, whether you collapse like Nietzsche or integrate like Jung. And so, we return to the cultural stage. If enough individuals choose integration, the collective psyche itself shifts. If not, history repeats its catastrophes. This was never just about you. Jung insisted that the psyche of the individual and the psyche of the collective are inseparable. The world hangs by a thin thread, he wrote, and that thread is the psyche of man. When you claim solitude as self-defense, you are not only saving your own vessel, you are altering the collective fabric. Look around. A culture addicted to speed tells you to merge instantly. A marketplace built on attention demands you perform endlessly. Families, religions, even nations often prefer fusion to individuation because fused people are easier to control. Every time you pause, every time you refuse to collapse into premature union, you are not only protecting yourself, you are disrupting the unconscious machinery of society. Because when you resist scarcity, therefore you teach the culture that love cannot be rushed. Because when you reclaim shadow, therefore you weaken the cycle of projection that fuels conflict. Because when you honor solitude, therefore you reveal that wholeness is possible without possession. This is why your season of singleness matters, not because it spares you heartbreak, that is too small a reason, but because it pioneers a new model of intimacy. You are rehearsing for a future in which love is no longer regression into fusion, but a conscious alliance of sovereign beings. Think of it. If even a fraction of the rare personalities Jung described chose solitude consciously rather than fleeing it, the entire cultural script of love would change. Relationships would cease being cages of projection and become crucibles of transformation. Families would transmit not wounds, but wholeness. Communities would no longer demand conformity at the expense of the soul. Your choice is not private, it is archetypal. It is medicine for a culture collapsing under unconscious fusion. And so we return to the paradox with which we began. We began with a paradox. Singleness does not mean weakness, it means defense. Now, at the end, we can see it fully. Solitude is not exile, but initiation. The danger isn't that you love too little. The danger is that you fuse too soon. The danger isn't that you are isolated. The danger is that you collapse into others before you've even met yourself. The danger isn't that you carry too much shadow. The danger is that you project it into bonds that cannot bear its weight. Jung showed us this. The blackening of Nigredo is not failure, but the first stage of rebirth. The emptiness of solitude is not a wound, but the womb. What you call absence is presence, the presence of the self, the center that can withstand the fire of love without dissolving. Because you endure the dark silence, therefore you prepare to meet another not as rescuer or addict, but as equal. Because you build your container, therefore love no longer threatens to annihilate you. Because you reclaim projection, therefore intimacy becomes mirror, not prison. This was never avoidance. This was spiritual self-defense. This was never running away. This was training for union. And so, I leave you with the task. Identify your phase. Are you in the black sun of Nigredo, dissolving illusions? In the whitening of Albedo, clarifying values? In the reddening of Rubedo, integrating desire with dignity? Name your stage and walk it consciously. Then share your reflection. Write it, speak it, live it. Your individuation is not only personal, it is cultural medicine. Each time you refuse collapse, you model a new way of being that others can follow. The danger isn't that you feel too deeply, or see too clearly, or demand too much. The danger is only this, that you fail to build a conscious relationship with those capacities. Use them as medicine, use them as leverage, use them as your contribution to what is next. The privilege of a lifetime, Jung said, is to become who you truly are. Do not trade that privilege for premature fusion. Stand whole. Then, if love comes, let it meet you at your center.